Reading the Times for Saturday, February 8th, 2020. Trump fires impeachment witnesses Gordon Sondland and Alexander Vindman in post-acquittal purge. Mr. Sondland, who was deeply involved in the effort to pressure Ukraine to announce investigations into Mr. Trump's Democratic rivals, testified that we followed the president's orders and that everyone was in the loop. Colonel Vindman testified that he brought concerns about Mr. Trump's July 25th phone call with Ukraine's president to National Security Council officials. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and his twin brother, right? The president said at one point on Thursday during a rambling, hour-long venting session at the White House, his voice dripping with disdain. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, a Republican who voted to acquit the president but expressed hopes that Mr. Trump would learn a lesson from the impeachment, said that witnesses should not be punished for giving the House required testimony. Victors in Iowa, Sanders and Buttigieg are targets in Democratic debate. The two victors in the Iowa caucuses, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and former Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, came under sharp and sustained criticism in a Democratic presidential debate on Friday as their rivals tried to stop their momentum by assailing Mr. Sanders for his left-wing ideas and past opposition to gun control, while targeting Mr. Buttigieg over his thin resume and ties to big donors. For Mr. Biden and two other major candidates, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, the debate was a crucial and perhaps final opportunity to reassert themselves in the race and to prevent Mr. Buttigieg and Mr. Sanders from establishing a tight grip on the respective wings of the party. Mr. Sanders on the left and Mr. Buttigieg closer to the political center. On Friday afternoon, Mr. Buttigieg and Mr. Sanders both claimed victory in Iowa on different grounds, with Mr. Sanders brandishing his lead in the popular vote and Mr. Buttigieg staking his claim on a hair-breadth lead over Mr. Sanders in state delegates, the traditional metric for judging a winner in the caucuses there. How Pete Buttigieg became the surprise of the Iowa caucuses. 2 days before the Iowa caucuses, Pete Buttigieg stopped for a town hall event at the Wynn Coliseum, the 92-year-old music venue that in its heyday hosted the likes of Lawrence Welk and Sammy Kaye. Recent history suggested there weren't many Democrats to win over in Wynn after President Barack Obama won surrounding Fayette County by 12% points in 2012. Donald J. Trump carried it by 19 points 4 years later. Now, as the focus turns to New Hampshire and his primary next Tuesday, Mr. Buttigieg has emerged as a formidable top-tier contender, harnessing the momentum from Iowa and campaigning with confidence and a large dose of swagger. Senior campaign officials have repeatedly told donors, and Mr. Buttigieg echoes the pitch on the stump speech to voters, that in the immediate aftermath of Barack Obama's surprising Iowa caucus victory in 2008, he gathered newfound black support and a gusher of donations. This is the toughest question facing Harvey Weinstein's jury. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office made an unusually risky decision when it brought criminal charges against Harvey Weinstein. It is rare to prosecute such cases, according to police officials, defense lawyers, and victims advocates across the country. Sexual contact afterward is very problematic, unless it really can be thoroughly explained and understood. said Roger Caneff, a former prosecutor in New York. The prosecution rested its case on Thursday, leaving the defense to call the last few witnesses in the days ahead. Over the past 3 weeks, the two sides have built competing narratives to answer a critical question. Why did Miriam Haley and Jessica Mann, the two central accusers, agree to have sex and other contact with Mr. Weinstein? Money. Job growth gives the economy an upbeat start to the year. The job market stayed on a path of steady growth in January. The job market sprang to life in January, kicking off the election year with some good news for a president who has made the economy the centerpiece of his bid for re-election. Hiring slowed somewhat last year amid trade tensions and recession fears, but the job market has proven resilient. A new martyr puts a face on China's deepening coronavirus crisis. Liu Wenliang's death has become an emotional flashpoint, said Wang Lu, a Wuhan man in his 20s, showing the torrent of comments on his phone about Dr. Li in his social media feeds. While many of the lives lost in the coronavirus outbreak have been obscured by numbers, Dr. Li's death had provided a face and a story for the victims of the epidemic and the medical workers struggling to contain it. Several top officials and State Department outlets had joined in the chorus mourning Dr. Li's death. A one-time refugee child takes on Austria's far right. Call her Austria's AOC. Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the superstar Democratic representative from New York City, Miss Zadak is clever, winning, young, and idealistic, and has a proud hyphenated identity. As for Miss Zadak, even friends feel conflicted. She has a mission impossible, said Stephanie Crisper, a lawmaker from the centrist party NEOS. For Miss Zadak, it is more complicated than that. After Miss Zadak joined the government, her fellow Greens irked her by celebrating her as the country's first Muslim minister. Passenger plane drew fire in Syria, Russia says. A passenger plane with 172 people aboard made an emergency landing at a Russian military base in Syria on Thursday, after drawing fire from Syrian air defenses in the aftermath of Israeli airstrikes in the area. Russian state news agencies reported on Friday. A spokesman for the Russian Defense Ministry, Igor Konashenkov, blamed Israel for the near miss, accusing the Israeli military of habitually using civilian aircraft to stop Syrian air defenses from retaliating against its strikes, Interfax reported. The Israeli General Staff carries out such operations using civilians, passenger airplanes as cover to block answering fire from the Syrian anti-aircraft forces, Mr. Konashenkov said in a statement released to Russian news outlets. Taliban militant flees prison claiming deal with Pakistani security forces. If verified, the claim by the Taliban militant Sajid Mahmoud, also known by his nom de guerre, Ehsanullah Hassan, would bring renewed scrutiny to the country's ties to the group. An associate of Mr. Mahmoud and a Pakistani intelligence official supported the claim, saying that the militant had agreed to the surrender in exchange for a large payout by the country's security forces. Pakistani security forces are now offering Mr. Mahmoud more money to turn himself back in, but he has refused the offer, officials say. 160 nations ban these weapons. The U.S. now embraces them. Some of these weapons, including landmines and cluster bombs, have been rejected by many nations. How can these policies be justified? knowing that so many people have decided that these weapons have no place in war fighting, and what these weapons do to people all over the world, including American service members, asked Rachel Stahl, an arms control expert at the Stimson Center, a nonpartisan policy research organization. The American military's recent moves to make landmines and cluster weapons easier to use have elicited widespread criticism. Karen Pierce is named UK ambassador to the U.S. Karen Pierce, a senior career diplomat, will become Britain's next ambassador to the United States, inheriting the tricky task of strengthening the country's somewhat frayed a special relationship with Washington at a time when London is at odds with Washington over several critical policies. Just days after Britain's official exit from the bloc, transatlantic relations were roiled over Britain's decision to defy American warnings and give the Chinese telecommunications firm Huawei a limited role in the construction of the new British 5G broadband network. British diplomats are also fretting over differences with Washington over Britain's plan for a digital service tax, which would hit large American corporations like Google and Amazon, and its policy toward Iran. While London has said positive things about Mr. Trump's peace initiative in the Middle East, its Iran policy is in line with that of France and Germany, which, against mounting odds, want to keep alive the nuclear deal that Iran signed during the Barack Obama years. Jump in coronavirus cases on ship poses a critical test for Japan. Japanese health workers have screened 279 people from a ship who showed symptoms or who had come in contact with the infected man. The health ministry said on Friday that people infected with coronavirus had been taken to hospitals across several prefectures. Someone is going to brewer. Someone is going to have to weigh both the public health consequences of requiring hundreds of people to be held in quarantine and the political consequences, said Timothy Brewer, a professor at the Schools of Medicine and Public Health at the University of California, Los Angeles. CDC and WHO offers to help China have been ignored for weeks. For more than a month, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention has been offering to send teams of experts to China to observe its coronavirus outbreak and help if it can. China has agreed to a mission of international experts to better understand disease transmission and clinical severity. Dr. Michael Ryan, the WHO's emergency response chief, said at the time, the two fields in which China appear to need outside help, experts say, are molecular virology and epidemiology. In Hong Kong, the coronavirus strikes a wounded city. Hong Kong has suffered through months of political unrest. Many in Hong Kong fear the growing power of the mainland Chinese government in the city's affairs, especially after the high-profile disappearances of people wanted or disliked by Beijing with little reaction from city officials. Hong Kong's population became frustrated as city officials dismissed evidence of excessive police violence. New report on 138 coronavirus cases reveals disturbing details. One patient admitted to a hospital in Wuhan, China, infected at least 10 healthcare workers and 4 other patients with the coronavirus that has sickened more than 30,000 people, killed 700, and reached 24 other countries. The finding is a heads up to doctors to keep an eye on these patients. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, said in a recorded interview posted by JAMA. Like previous reports on coronavirus patients, this one found that older people and those with underlying health problems like diabetes, heart disease, or cancer tended to be more severely ill than younger, healthier patients. The data on the patients show that the illness caused pneumonia and a systemic viral infection that set off a powerful inflammatory response in the body. Dr. William Schaffner, an infectious disease expert at Vanderbilt University, said all of this in an interview. Inundated with flu patients, U.S. hospitals brace for coronavirus. Some hospitals in the United States are already critically low on respiratory masks, according to Premier Inc., which secures medical supplies and equipment on behalf of hospitals and health systems. All hospitals are taxed with a large flu season and other bugs, said Dr. Mark Jarrett, Chief Quality Officer for Northwell Health, which operates 23 hospitals across Long Island and elsewhere in New York. At Common Spirit Health, a large Catholic hospital system with 142 hospitals created through the merger of Dignity Health, based in San Francisco, and Catholic Health Initiatives, based in Chicago, patients and staff members are being instructed on how to distinguish coronavirus from the flu. Endless night at negative 50 degrees. A look at life on an icebreaker. The expedition, called Mosaic, has been frozen in Arctic ice since September. In the first few months, the expedition encountered wild storms, constantly shifting and cracking the ice, that made setting up instruments difficult, and the occasional polar bear. Pretty much every day during the part of the expedition, we had formations of new cracks and the ice that sent massive events when pressure ridges form, with ice piling up 1 or 2 stories high. Germans unnerved by political turmoil that echoes Nazi era. A report last year by ARD, Germany's public broadcaster, identified at least 18 cases of cooperation between the AfD and mainstream parties. Even inside the conservative camp, some voices are urging the rethinking of the policy of the cordon sanitaire around the AfD. Martin Patzelt, a vocal defender of Ms. Merkel's 2015 refugee policy and a member of her conservatives, is no friend of the AfD, but he says he understands why isolating the party riles its voters, and some conservative Christian Democrat voters too. The AfD can't be bypassed anymore. Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD's parliamentary group, said triumphantly. Why Matteo Salvini wouldn't mind being prosecuted. In one of his last official acts, Mr. Salvini prevented the Italian Coast Guard ship, the Gregoretti, from bringing rescued migrants to an Italian port for days. On January 31st, a Palermo court made a similar request concerning a Spanish aid boat carrying scores of migrants, some of whom Mr. Salvini kept adrift for weeks, in violation of a court order allowing them to enter Italian waters. In the meantime, Italian political analysts have argued that Mr. Salvini needed to move toward the center to expand his support beyond 33%. Spanish terrorist is extradited from Brazil after decades on the run. In January 1977, Mr. Garcia Julia and 2 other militants attacked the law firm's offices close to Madrid's Atocha station and shot dead 3 lawyers, an administrator, and a law student. Mr. Garcia Julia was detained shortly after the Atocha killings and sentenced to 193 years in prison in 1980. Mr. Garcia Julia is due to serve more than a decade in prison for the Atocha killings, and he could also face a new trial in violating the terms of his parole. Putin Putin rejects oil deal with Belarus, increasing pressure for merger. In January, after the collapse late last year of talks between Russia and Belarus over forming a union state, Russia temporarily halted deliveries of oil, prompting Belarus to buy a shipment of pricey oil from Norway and hunt for other suppliers. Belarus's relations with the United States and Europe have improved steadily in recent years, particularly since Russia annexed Crimea from neighboring Ukraine in 2014. Mr. Lukashenko, concerned about his own territory, began distancing himself from Russian actions, mindful of the violence unleashed in eastern Ukraine by Russia in retaliation for that country turning towards the West in 2014. Few people in Belarus want to risk a rupture with Russia. China's lavish funds lured U.S. scientists. What did it get in return? A spokeswoman for China's embassy in Washington, Feng Hong, said the Thousands Talents program was similar to the recruitment programs of other countries, intended to promote international cooperation in science. In 2018, Jeff Sessions, the then Attorney General, announced a China initiative after several cases came to light of scientists illicitly providing China with technology and research findings paid for by federal agencies. Dr. Antila, the organic chemist who relocated to Tianjin, said there were indeed ethical minefields for recipients holding positions in China and the United States, and that he eventually decided to move his work entirely to China to avoid them. House approves Puerto Rico aid package, but a path forward is murky. The House on Friday approved sending $4.89 billion in emergency recovery aid and additional tax relief to Puerto Rico after a series of devastating earthquakes, most likely reigniting a feud with President Dumbass over his objections to sending federal money to an island battered by national disasters and mismanagement. Mr. Dumbass has personally clashed with the island's leadership and objected to sending aid to the island, despite Mr. Dumbass's repeated castigation of Puerto Rican officials. It was a former top FEMA administrator working on the island who was arrested in September for taking bribes during the island's recovery from Hurricane Maria. Mitch McConnell wasn't always loved by Republicans. He is now. How has Mitch McConnell blessed the Republican Party? Let these Kentucky women count the ways. Even voters like Miss Stocks weren't so sure about Mr. McConnell once upon a time, when Tea Party firebrands tempted them with visions of a new kind of Republican. The way Mr. McConnell compliments the president cannot alone explain his now widened support in his party. How it is that the past 5 years, his approval rating among Republicans nationally has climbed to 68% from a low 26%, according to surveys from Gallup and Quinnipiac University. Farm bailout paid to Brazilian meat processor angers lawmakers. The Batista family, through a holding company, remains the largest shareholder of JBS. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida, and Senator Bom Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey, as well as Representative Rosa DeLauro, Democrat of Connecticut, have asked Sonny Perdue, the Agriculture Secretary, to investigate JBSA. I have not had a reply from the Secretary, Ms. DeLauro said, adding that the money was supposed to be going to struggling farmers. JBS USA, which has required other American meat companies under its umbrella, said the government purchased just $67 million of pork products at the company with trade mitigation funds, and the additional purchases were from different funds that support the National School Lunch Program and other federal food and nutrition assistance programs. Mr. Rubio raised his concerns about JBS, which stem in part from whether the company was able to purchase American companies through ill-gotten loans, in a Senate hearing to confirm the incoming ambassador to Brazil, Todd C. Chapman, in December. Court throws out emoluments case brought against Trump by Democrats. A federal appeals court panel threw out on Friday a lawsuit by 215 Democratic members of Congress accusing President Trump of illegally accepting benefits from foreign governments, saying that individual lawmakers cannot sue the president on behalf of the entire Congress. The appeals panel was made up of Judge Karen L. Henderson and Thomas B. Griffith, who were appointed by Republican presidents, and David S. Tatel, who was appointed by President Bill Clinton, a Democrat. A third case is pending in New York. Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, who strongly supported the congressional lawsuit, said he was deeply disappointed and alarmed by Friday's ruling. Former PIMCO CEO gets 9 months in prison in college admissions case. Of all the wealthy parents charged in the sprawling college admissions scandal, prosecutors have described Douglas Hodge, the retired chief executive of the bond giant PIMCO, as one of the most active and prolific people involved. In court filings, prosecutors described Mr. Hodge and 3 other parents, including the founder of a financial firm and an heiress whose father and uncle invented hot pockets, as far away the most culpable parents to have pleaded guilty in the case. In addition to the 2 years they sought in Mr. Hodge's case, prosecutors recommended relatively lengthy sentences for the 3 other parents, ranging from 18 to 26 months. Kobe Bryant helicopter crash wreckage shows no evidence of engine failure. The 2 engines recovered from the wreckage of the helicopter crash that killed the former basketball player star Kobe Bryant and 8 others showed no clear evidence of major internal failure, investigators said in a preliminary report released on Friday. Investigators released a preliminary report into the helicopter crash that killed Kobe Bryant, his daughter Gianna, and several others. Much of the helicopter, Sikorsky SK-76B, outfitted to hold 2 pilots and 8 passengers, was destroyed on impact, and a fire broke out in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Biden tells voters to look past. Biden tells voters to look to the past, just not the last week. For months, he played the big talking frontrunner, swaggering if rarely steady, hoping voters would not linger too long on the tautology of his premise. Joe Biden was the candidate who should win, he told fellow Democrats, because he was a candidate who could win. Since joining the race last year, Mr. Biden has presented himself as the safest choice for risk-averse times, the "okay, I'll do that" option for Democrats whose chief priority has been finding candidates best positioned to defeat President Dumbass. With Mr. Biden set back in Iowa and a slate of flawed competitors beside him on stage on Friday, their shortcomings laid bare in several punchy exchanges throughout the night, the party has been left to consider an unsettling truth. Democrats discuss abortion rights in depth at debate. In the most substantive debate statements to date on abortion, several of the leading Democratic presidential candidates reaffirmed on Friday night that if elected, they would put forward only Supreme Court nominees who supported Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision establishing a woman's right to an abortion. I've lived in America in which abortions were legal, and the rich women still got abortions. And that's what we have to remember about this. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts said, arguing that Roe v. Wade would be codified. Ms. Warren added, states are heading towards trying to ban abortion outright, and the Supreme Court seems headed in exactly that direction as well. If we are going to protect the people of the United States of America, and we are going to protect our rights to have dominion over our own bodies, then that's going to mean we can't simply rely on the courts. Joe Biden shakes up campaign leadership, elevating Anita Dunn. In another indication that Mr. Biden knows he must quickly turn his campaign around, his senior aides reached out this week to Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, a former Obama campaign official who ran Beto O'Rourke's campaign. The move follows days of speculation inside Mr. Biden's Philadelphia headquarters about potential staff shakeup, following a disappointing Iowa result that has complicated Mr. Biden's path forward. It's not clear that promoting Ms. Dunn will alter Mr. Biden's trajectory in the race or be the last change Mr. Biden makes. Elizabeth Warren has a Pete Buttigieg problem. Christine Bagley, 65, said Miss Warren had been her top choice, but described her as a bit of a bulldog, saying Mr. Buttigieg made her feel more hopeful and inspired. Louis Luddy, 66, also considered Miss Warren, but she said she was too bellicose. In the run-up to the caucuses, Miss Warren's campaign highlighted her ability to become voters' second choice, the supposed evidence of her status as a Democratic unity candidate. But as results trickled in from the state, it was Mr. Buttigieg who gained the most from the so-called second alignment, as supporters of candidates such as Mr. Biden, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, and the businessman Andrew Yang shifted to Mr. Buttigieg when their top choice failed to cross the viability threshold. Roger Lau, Miss Warren's campaign manager, pounced on a tweet from one of Mr. Buttigieg's senior advisors, suggesting that it seemed to signal an outside super PAC supporting Mr. Buttigieg about where it should spend money on advertising. What? Roger Lau, Miss pounced on a tweet, suggesting it seemed to signal to an outside super PAC supporting Mr. where they should spend money on advertising. Oh, gosh. Joe Walsh ends challenge to Trump after getting 1% in Iowa. Joe Walsh, the conservative radio show host, former Tea Party congressman from Illinois, is running a presidential campaign challenging President Dumbass fitness for office. Announced on Friday, he was ending his bid for the Republican nomination. Mr. Walsh entered the race last August. He was once part of a trio of Republicans challenging Mr. Dumbass, who together were involved in a quixotic attempt to peel away support from a president with an iron grip on his party. Joe Walsh is a very different person than Bill Wield, but he's a good person, and he makes a good effort to explain how the Tea Party Republicans could stand up to Mr. Dumbass. People weren't willing to follow. Buttigieg leads Sanders in Iowa delegates 13-12. So, who won? The AP has announced Thursday afternoon that it would not declare a winner in Iowa's first-in-the-nation contest, but the allocation provides a new clarity about the accumulation of delegates that are necessary to win the Democratic presidential nomination. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts took 8 delegates. Former Vice President Joseph R. Biden received 6, and Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota had 1, according to the AP. The AP calculated the distribution of 40 of Iowa's 41 National Convention delegates, state delegates equivalents in the run-up to the caucuses. We surveyed media organizations on how they would determine a winner in Iowa, and they basically agreed state delegate equivalents. The latest New Hampshire polls. Buttigieg looks competitive. Welcome to Poll Watch, our weekly look at polling data and survey results on the candidates, voters, and issues that will shape the 2020 election. Suffolk has been polling New Hampshire voters constantly this week, releasing new results from its tracking poll every day. When the Monmouth poll had a 4-day collection period, which began on the day of the Iowa caucuses, the latest Globe Suffolk poll was only collected on Wednesday and Thursday. The government uses near-perfect surveillance data on Americanos. When the government tracks the location of a cell phone, it achieves near-perfect surveillance, as if it had attached an ankle monitor to the phone's user, wrote John Roberts, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in a 2018 ruling that prevented the government from obtaining location data from cell phone towers without a warrant. The data used by the government comes not from the phone companies, but from a location data company as one of many that are quietly and relentlessly collecting the precise movement on all smartphone-owning Americans through their phone apps. Exhibit A is the notion that Carpenter rulings applies only to location data captured by cell phone towers, and not to location data streaming from smartphone apps, which can produce nearly identical troves of information. The harrowing chaos of the Democratic primary. While Sanders claimed a popular vote victory in Iowa, there is no surge in voter turnout since last election, and an NBC News entrance poll showed that the number of first-time caucusers actually went down. Still, with the survival of American democracy at stake, it seems like a wild gamble for Democrats to turn the fight against dumbass into a referendum on democratic socialism at a time when Americans' personal economic satisfaction is at a record high. That's left the erstwhile novelty candidate, Pete Buttigieg, as Biden's strongest competitor for moderate votes. But while he's shooting up the polls in New Hampshire, he has virtually no support among voters of color. Lonely are the brave. The right-wing vituperations descending on Romney, directed by the president and amplified through his media minions, are no better than the left's cancel culture warriors, seeking to wreck the lives of anyone who falls short of expectations or doesn't toe the ideological line. I'm sure to hear abuse from the president and his supporters, Romney predicted, knowing Trump never disappoints the meanest expectations. If Mitt Romney's lonely vote proves anything, it's that political courage makes the patriot. Democrats gave Obama a free pass. That could hurt us on election day. A former aide to Mr. Obama, Neera Tanden, wrote on Twitter that Democratic candidates who attacked Obama are wrong and terrible. She added, "Obama wasn't perfect. Come on, people. Next to dumbass, he kind of is. Black voters' attitudes about the impact of the Obama administration are complicated because they hold Barack and Michelle Obama in such high regard. The inattention to Mr. Obama's record meant that the conventional wisdom explanation for white voters' defection from the Obama coalition is racist backlash, not economic hardship." What South Dakota doesn't get about transgender children. While there is broad consensus among doctors that these affirmative medical protocols are important, legislators in several states are planning to make this medical care illegal. In South Dakota, the House recently passed a bill that would allow a fine or even imprison pediatricians who provide gender affirmative care to patients under 16. The bills are about medical care, but the state representatives are sponsoring them seem unfazed by the fact that all the relevant major medical organizations disagree with them. While conservatives highlight that youth may later regret the physical changes from estrogen or testosterone, the doctors who take care of these patients know it's far more likely that the young transgendered person will have regrets when physicians refuse to provide the medical care to pause the puberty that is actively distressing them. After acquittal, Trump's attacks on opponents. Your article about President Trump's comments at the National Prayer Breakfast amply illustrate how uncouth, vindictive, and unrepentant he is. Nor is a problem that Mr. Trump will slime whomever he runs against, though he will, nor that the Electoral College gives him a big advantage, though it does, nor even that Democrats' impeachment of Mr. Trump was an amateur circus, though it was. Many voters are focused on who can beat Trump, which is to say, who can save the country. We need someone who can stand up and remind us why this country is worth saving in the first place. We need Shaz. Where's Shaz? Let's get Shaz to run. I want Shaz to be our president. Make sure you write that. Remembering Alice Mayhew, a great editor. Many thanks to David Masello for sharing his warm reflections on the editor, Alice Mayhew, who died Tuesday. In this moment, when harsh words and even harsher policies are the order of the day, it's important to remember how to read a newspaper and to read it every day, to thank people for acts of kindness, and as an editor, to work hard to preserve an author's voice, keeping a stash of postcards in your desk drawer, encouraging young people. Such simple but crucial advice. With this article, Miss Mayhew has become a mentor to us all. Again, Roger Cohen speaks like no other for my broken European heart. His writings are my hymns for the European idea, for humanity. Thank you from a lost Austrian soul from chilly London. Reading Dr. Joseph Stern's account of the agonizing ambivalence surrounding cessation of medical interventions for neurologically devastated patients, I had a flashback to times I had been in the same situation as a pediatrician. Like Dr. Stern's examples, my patients were always young. But one of the most poignant lessons I learned about keeping the body alive came during my residency training. During a tough block spent in the pediatric intensive care unit, a 13-year-old boy got hold of a relative's handgun and shot himself through the temple. The bullet's path was on a CT scan, almost cartoonish trajectory of destruction. His family decided on organ donation. My mentor said of the boy, "He is now the most important patient on this unit." We all stood in respect as his gurney was wheeled to the operating room to harvest his organs. They gave life to 7 people. A young father was investigated 4 times. Then his newborn died. Not only had the police arrested him twice on charges he had assaulted the baby's mother, but authorities investigated him 4 times over allegations of child abuse in the family, including once where another son had a broken leg, law enforcement officials told the New York Times. The city's Administration for Children's Services, which handles child abuse allegations, and the New York Police Department, which investigated at least one suspected case of abuse in the family, have not explained how the agencies responded to a troubling sequence of violence. The Administration for Children's Services placed the boys in foster care while the police investigated if they were abused. Officials said. New York to sue Trump administration over a global entry freeze. New York State officials said on Friday they plan to sue the Trump administration over its decision this week to ban thousands of New Yorkers from enrolling in programs that allow travelers to circumvent long lines at airports and borders. The lawsuit will be brought by New York's Attorney General Letitia James and will argue that the federal government's actions were arbitrary and capricious, does not provide state residents equal protection, and violated the state's sovereign immunity, officials said. New York is one of the more than dozen states that have passed laws allowing undocumented immigrants to obtain a driver's license. Memories fade. Weinstein's lawyers tried to discredit Annabella Sciorra. Harvey Weinstein's lawyers began their defense at his rape trial in Manhattan with testimony intended to discredit one of the prosecution's strongest witnesses, the actress Annabella Sciorra, who claims Mr. Weinstein attacked her in the early 1990s. On Thursday, Manhattan prosecutors rested their case against Mr. Weinstein, the once powerful Hollywood producer, after 3 weeks of testimony from more than 24 witnesses, including 6 women who said he raped or sexually assaulted them. So then, at 27 years, asked Diana Fabi Sampson, one of Mr. Weinstein's lawyers, referring to the amount of time that had passed since Mr. Weinstein allegedly attacked Miss Sciorra. Real estate group to challenge the ban on broker fees for renters. In the lawsuit, the groups are expected to accuse the Department of State for failing to follow a state act that spells out how agencies are expected to issue rules and regulations. The 2 groups said the Department of State, before issuing the guidance, should have sought input from the real estate industry and presented it for review before the state's Board of Real Estate. The state published the legal guidance on Tuesday night, stunning the real estate industry by saying that the last year's sweeping rent laws, which do not explicitly mention broker commissions, barred tenants from having to pay a broker's fee. Black workers' wages are finally rising. The median black worker still makes 78 cents to the median white worker. It's $1 each week. His mother, a teacher, had to take time off work after a bad car accident, and then struggle to find new work as the economy reeled. Some economists hope that as more workers like Ms. Mitchell get a foothold in the labor market and even manage to climb up a few rungs up the ladder, they could be better positioned to weather an eventual recession. Justice Department drops antitrust probe against automakers that sided with California on emissions. The Justice Department has dropped its antitrust inquiry into 4 automakers that had sided with California in its dispute with the dumbass administration over reducing climate-warming vehicle pollution, deciding that companies who had violated no laws, according to the people familiar with the matter. The Justice Department's move was one of a slew of seemingly retributive acts by the White House against California, as the state worked with 4 automakers, Ford Motor Company, Volkswagen of America, Honda, and BMW, to define Mr. Dumbass's planned rollback of national fuel economy standards. In the months after California struck a deal with automakers, the administration and Justice Department pushed an unusual series of legal and policy moves against California and the auto companies that backed the state's climate change plan. Widespread outcry in China over the death of coronavirus doctor. The Chinese public have staged what amounts to an online revolt after the death of a doctor, Li Wenling, who had tried to warn of a mysterious virus that had killed hundreds of people in China, infected tens of thousands, and forced the government to corral many of the country's 1.4 billion people. Since late Thursday, people from different backgrounds, including government officials, prominent business figures, and ordinary online users, have posted numerous messages and expressing their grief at the doctor's death and their anger over his silencing by the police after sharing his knowledge about the new coronavirus. We should be more tolerant of people who post untruthful information that aren't malicious, he said in a post. Clearview's facial recognition app is identifying child victims of abuse. In numerous publicity documents, Clearview promotes the use of its technology by law enforcement to solve child sexual abuse cases. Since Clearview's practices have come to light, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Venmo, and YouTube have sent the company cease and desist letters, asking it to stop scraping photos from their sites and delete existing images in its database. Clearview received a letter from Senator Edward Markey, a Democrat of Massachusetts, asking for a list of law enforcement agencies that have used the app and whether biometric information has been collected for children under 13 years of age. Former UAW official pleads guilty in corruption scandal. A former top official at the United Automobile Workers Union pleaded guilty on Friday to conspiring with fellow officials in a scheme that siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars in members' dues to support spending on villa rentals, lavish meals, golf clubs, golf outings. At the center of the embezzlement scheme was an accounting device known as a master account, which union officials set up hotels in cities like Palm Springs, California, ostensibly to cover expenses during union conferences. He helped conceal expenditures by Mr. Williams' spouse and other spouses of union officials, including an outing to the San Diego Zoo Safari Park. Mr. Jones and Mr. Williams appeared in court filings only as Official A and Official B, but union officials have confirmed the pseudonyms refer to them. Chinese car factories idled by virus raise risks to global growth. Many automakers had planned to reopen their Chinese factories on Monday, which was already a week later than planned following the traditional Lunar New Year holiday. PSA, the French maker of Peugeot and Citroën cars, said its three car factories in Wuhan, the center of the epidemic in China, would remain closed until February 14th. The virus had also interrupted production far from Wuhan. The German car maker BMW, which has 3 factories in Shenyang in the northern China, has suspended production until February 17th. Toyota said it will not resume full production as its 4 car and 8 component factories in China until February 17th, a week later than planned. Boeing Starliner's flights flaws show fundamental problem NASA says. An uncrewed test flight of a Boeing spacecraft designed to carry NASA astronauts may have narrowly avoided catastrophic failure in December. During a telephone news conference on Friday, Jim Bridenstine, the NASA administrator, said the mission had a lot of anomalies, but that it was important that the agency continue to work with Boeing to fix them. NASA could require Boeing to fly another uncrewed test, and the company took $410 million charge against its earnings last quarter in case it had to pay for that. How a vegan ends up with leather in her portfolio. First time U.S. vegan climate ETF. It is an index of sorts with 268 American stocks, and it begins with subtraction, removing companies and even whole industries that it considers animal unfriendly. The Carner Blue Animal Impact Fund, named for the endangered butterfly, takes a different approach. Ms. Benjamin said investors knew they were signing up for, including the fact that the fund's overarching organization also features an animal welfare advocacy and research organization, a political action committee, and a foundation, helping towns by seeding their own backyard with startups. Mr. Deshpande believes that working with local people has allowed E4All not only to make strong connections, but also to get support in both volunteer time and donations. In Pittsfield, Massachusetts, whose economy was shattered when General Electric closed its plant there in the 1990s, E4All has teamed up with the community groups and Niraj Shah, the chief executive of Wayfair, the online furniture company. Ms. Goodman began by mentoring a young woman who started a skincare company through E4All's program in Lowell, Massachusetts. She's now on her 5th mentoring team and is the chairwoman for E4All. More states require students to learn about money matters. A growing number of states are requiring students to study money matters in high school, the Council for Economic Education found, reflecting a broader realization that people are responsible for their own financial future. The head of the group said, recent research suggests that financial literacy is lacking among high school students in the United States. The research found that the states without the high state-level mandate for personal finance instruction, poor students had far less access to financial education compared to wealthier students. Credit Suisse CEO Tidjane Thiam exits after spying scandal. On Friday, Tidjane Thiam announced his resignation as chief executive from Credit Suisse, brought down over a spying scandal involving his neighbor, the bank's former head of wealth management, Iqbal Khan. The Swiss bank hired Mr. Thiam in 2015 to help the company round. Credit Suisse started its own inquiry conducted by an outside law firm, which found that the spying had been ordered by the bank's chief operating officer, Pierre-Olivier Bois, who resigned in October after the finding. Another Swiss newspaper, Sonntagszeitung, reported this month that Credit Suisse had spied on Greenpeace after the environmental group disrupted the bank's annual shareholder meeting in 2017. The bank declined comment on Friday on the more recently reported incidents of spying. Saudi-Russian alliance is strained as coronavirus saps demand for oil. An alliance between Saudi Arabia and Russia has been helped prop up oil prices for the last 3 years. Saudi Arabia's oil minister Abdulaziz bin Salman wanted to move ahead quickly with a meeting to consider new production cuts, but he has struggled to persuade Moscow, even after his father, King Salman, made a call to President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia on Monday. The inability to reach a quick consensus inevitably raises concerns about whether Saudi Arabia, the de facto leader of OPEC, and Russia were still able to work together to coordinate oil policy. U.S. divided over Chinese drone bans. The Agricultural Department, which uses drones to survey farmland, for example, said it could limit the ability to carry out our mission-critical work and halt the Forest Service's use of drones altogether. The debate over drones, which are primarily made in either China or with Chinese parts, show how attempts to decouple America from Chinese industry can crash into the realities of the global tech supply chain. Representative Mike Gallagher, a Wisconsin Republican and sponsor of a law banning federal agencies from buying Chinese drones, said he was unaware of the letters from the Agricultural Department, but noted that defense agencies had raised concerns about the flying devices. And that has been Reading the Times for Saturday, February 8th, 2020.